I retired after 38 years, then my family handed me a schedule for my new job. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our channel's new videos. It only takes a moment, it is completely free, and it is one of the best ways you can support us as we continue bringing you more dramatic, emotional, and meaningful stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us, and we sincerely appreciate every one of you who chooses to be here. Thank you very much. Now, let us go back to our main character. Dad, you need to follow this schedule. We can't keep rearranging our lives just because you're retired now. Melissa Bennett's voice cut across the dinner table before Richard had even finished setting down his coffee. He looked at his daughter, then at the single sheet of paper she had pushed toward him with the careful confidence of someone presenting a plan already approved. At the top, in bold letters, were 4 words, Grandpa's weekly schedule. Richard said nothing. His eyes moved slowly down the page. Monday, 6:30 a.m. Take Ethan and Sophie to school. 9 a.m. Grocery pickup. 11:30, laundry. 3 p.m. School pickup. 5:30, dinner prep. Tuesday looked almost identical. Wednesday added soccer practice. Thursday included a plumber appointment at Melissa's house. Saturday had one word stretched across the afternoon, babysitting. Richard stared at the page long enough for the refrigerator's quiet hum to become noticeable. 38 years. He had worked for 38 years, waking before sunrise, measuring mornings in alarm clocks and traffic reports, lunches in 30-minute breaks, evenings in whatever energy remained after work. 3 days ago, he had finally retired. 3 days. And somehow his empty calendar had already become family property. You made me a work schedule, he asked. Melissa leaned back in her chair. At 36, she had inherited her father's habit of organizing everything, but not always his patience. It's not work, Dad. It's family stuff. Her husband, Jason Miller, glanced at the paper and nodded as though the distinction settled everything. Honestly, it'll be good for you. Gives you something to do. Richard's fingers rested against the edge of the schedule. Something to do. The phrase landed harder than either of them realized. For nearly 4 decades, people had needed him somewhere every morning. His supervisors needed reports. Coworkers needed decisions. His children once needed rides, tuition checks, repaired bicycles, late-night advice, and someone sitting in the bleachers no matter how exhausted he was. Now retirement had apparently erased all of that history and replaced it with an assumption that a man without a paycheck was a man without plans. Richard looked toward his son Daniel, seated across the table. Daniel gave a small shrug. Come on, Dad. You're retired. What else have you got going on? A few people laughed. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. Richard looked around the table and realized nobody seemed to recognize what had just happened. Melissa was already explaining Wednesday's pickup procedure. Jason was checking something on his phone. Daniel reached for another dinner roll. They had divided Richard's week as casually as people dividing leftovers. And when exactly am I retired? Richard asked. Melissa stopped. What? I'm looking at Monday through Saturday. He tapped the page once. So I'm asking which day is retirement. Jason smiled awkwardly. Richard, nobody's trying to put you to work. Richard lifted his eyes. Then why does it have a start time? Silence flickered across the table, brief but unmistakable. Melissa exhaled. Dad, you don't have a job anymore. There it was. Simple. Practical. Almost innocent. Richard leaned back and studied his daughter. She wasn't trying to hurt him. That was what unsettled him most. She genuinely believed that because his career had ended, his time had become available for assignment. His gaze returned to the schedule. For 38 years, Richard Bennett had dreamed about one particular morning. No alarm, no commute, no one waiting for him to arrive. His late wife Susan used to tease him about it. Someday, she'd say, you'll wake up and the whole day will belong to you. Richard had believed her. He had carried that promise through overtime shifts, missed vacations, mortgage payments, college bills, and years that seemed to disappear faster with age. Now, 72 hours into retirement, someone had handed him another schedule. Melissa pushed a pen toward him. I just need you to confirm Thursday because I already made my appointment. Richard looked at the pen but didn't touch it. Something changed behind his eyes, subtle enough that nobody at the table noticed. He folded the schedule once, carefully, then again. I'll look at it, he said. Melissa smiled, satisfied, and the conversation moved on. But Richard remained still, holding the folded paper between two fingers. Nobody there knew about the box waiting in his bedroom closet. Nobody knew Susan had written 3 words across its lid years earlier. Nobody knew Richard had planned to open it on his first free morning. And nobody understood that the schedule they had just handed him wasn't giving Richard Bennett his next job. It was about to remind him that, after 38 years, his remaining time finally belonged to him. Richard woke at 5:15 the next morning without an alarm. His eyes opened to darkness, and for several seconds his body behaved as though nothing had changed. 38 years had trained him too well. He reached toward the nightstand before remembering there was no alarm to silence, no traffic to beat, no supervisor expecting him before 7. He lay still and listened. The house was quiet. Beside him, the other half of the bed had been empty for 4 years, but some mornings Richard still expected to hear Susan breathing there. He finally rose, pulled on an old gray sweatshirt, and walked downstairs. By 5:30, coffee was dripping into the same navy mug he had carried to work for almost 20 years. He stood at the kitchen window watching the first hint of morning settle over the neighborhood. This was supposed to feel different. On his final Friday at work, his co-workers had filled the conference room with balloons, grocery store cake, and photographs collected from nearly 4 decades. Carol Hayes, who had worked beside him for 17 years, had handed him a retirement card thick with signatures. So what happens Monday morning? She had asked. Richard had smiled. I wake up without an alarm. Everyone laughed, but Susan would have understood. Freedom had never meant luxury to Richard. It meant owning an ordinary Tuesday. Drinking coffee while it was still hot. Driving somewhere because he wanted to go, not because someone expected him there. He carried his mug into the living room, and his eyes landed on the folded schedule Melissa had given him. He had left it on the end table the night before. Even folded, it seemed strangely official. Richard picked it up and opened it again. Melissa had color-coded the responsibilities. Blue for the grandchildren. Green for errands. Yellow for household tasks. His retirement had categories. His phone buzzed at 6:02. Melissa. Good morning, Dad. Small change. Can you pick up Ethan and Sophie this afternoon? Jason has a late meeting. Richard stared at the message. Before he could answer, another appeared. Also, we are almost out of milk. If you are near the store, could you grab 2 gallons? He typed, sure. His thumb hovered over the screen before sending it. Helping his daughter was not the problem. He loved Melissa. He adored Ethan and Sophie. For years he had wished for more time with them. But lately, something subtle had shifted. Requests arrived carrying the weight of decisions already made. By 2:45 that afternoon, Richard was parked outside the elementary school. Ethan climbed into the back seat talking about a science project before the door had fully closed. Sophie followed with a backpack nearly half her size. Grandpa, are you picking us up every day now? She asked. Richard glanced at her through the mirror. Why would you think that? Mom said you can because you do not work anymore. Richard smiled faintly. Did she? She said retirement means you have lots of free time. Free time. The phrase followed him all the way home. That evening, after dropping the children off and carrying the milk into Melissa's kitchen, he returned to his own house shortly after 6. The rooms felt larger than they had that morning. He walked upstairs and stopped outside the bedroom closet. Behind 2 winter coats sat a small cedar box he had avoided opening since Susan died. She had prepared it during the final year of her life, when they still talked as though time were something they could negotiate with. Richard pulled the box down and wiped a thin layer of dust from the lid. In Susan's handwriting were the words, "When we finally have time." His throat tightened. They had planned Yellowstone, a drive along the Pacific coast, a week in Maine when the leaves turned, and a dozen small places they kept postponing because there was always work, always tuition, always a family emergency that seemed more important. Richard placed his hand on the latch. His phone rang. "Daniel. Dad, quick favor. Since you're free tomorrow, can you wait at my place for the garage door guy? They gave me a 4-hour window." Richard looked at Susan's handwriting, then at the phone glowing in his hand. For several seconds, he said nothing. "Dad? You there?" Richard slowly removed his hand from the box. "I am here," he said. Daniel laughed. "Great. I knew I could count on you." Richard closed his eyes. Once, those words had made him feel needed. Now, for the first time, they made him wonder whether anyone in his family still understood the difference between being needed and being available. By Wednesday, Richard had spent more time driving for his family than he had driving for himself. At 7:10 in the morning, he was sitting inside Daniel's kitchen with a cup of coffee he had not wanted, waiting for a garage door technician who might arrive any time between 8 and noon. Daniel had already left for work. On the counter sat a yellow note. "Dad, if you have time, there are a few boxes in the basement that need to go to storage. Thanks." Richard read it twice. The garage appointment had somehow grown another assignment. At 11:47, the technician finally arrived. By 12:30, Richard had loaded 4 boxes into the trunk of his sedan. At 1:15, Melissa called. "Dad, where are you?" Richard glanced at the storage facility ahead of him. "Running an errand for Daniel." "Okay, perfect. Can you swing by my house afterward? Sophie left her soccer bag, and I cannot leave the office." Richard looked at the clock. "Practice is at 4, right?" 4:30. "You have plenty of time." "Not could you?" "Not are you busy?" "You have plenty of time." Richard felt the words settle somewhere deeper than irritation. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you. You are a lifesaver." The call ended. Richard sat in the parked car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. He remembered when hearing that had made him proud. When Melissa was 22 and her first car died on Interstate 95, she had called him before anyone else. Richard had left work early, driven 40 miles, and stayed until the tow truck came. When Daniel bought his first house, Richard spent 3 weekends helping him paint. When Ethan was born, Richard used vacation days so Melissa could sleep between feedings. He had never kept score. Family was not a ledger. But generosity changed when people stopped recognizing it as a choice. By Friday, the requests came faster. Melissa needed groceries picked up. Daniel needed someone to sign for a delivery. Jason asked whether Richard could take their dog to the veterinarian because his afternoon was packed. Richard said yes to all 3. Sunday evening, he sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and tried to plan his first real week of retirement. He wrote, "Tuesday, lake near the top." He had not gone fishing in almost 2 years. His phone buzzed before he could write anything else. It was a message from the family group chat. Richard rarely read the thread closely. Most of it was photographs, school reminders, and jokes he did not understand. This time, his name caught his attention. Jason had written, "I can book the dentist for Thursday if somebody can get Sophie." Melissa answered less than a minute later. "Do not book a sitter. Dad is free now." Richard stared at the screen. Daniel added, "Retirement finally paying off for all of us." A laughing face followed. Jason replied, best family benefit package ever. More laughing symbols appeared. Richard did not laugh. 3 words remained fixed in his mind. Dad is free now. He looked around his silent kitchen. The mortgage had been paid off after decades of work. Susan's chair still sat across from him. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, measuring seconds he had once believed would eventually belong to him. He typed a response, erased it, typed another, then erased that too. Instead, he placed the phone face down. The next morning, Melissa arrived without calling. She walked into the kitchen carrying a second printed schedule. I updated everything, she said. Soccer moved to Wednesday, and I added Friday dinner because Jason and I have plans. Richard looked at the new page. You added dinner? Just for the kids. Nothing complicated. Melissa, I had plans Friday. She paused, genuinely surprised. What plans? Richard studied her expression. The question was not curiosity. It was disbelief. Does it matter? No, but I already told Jason we were covered. Richard leaned back. You told him before asking me? Melissa sighed and set her purse on the counter. Dad, why are you making this difficult? You always said you wanted more time with the family. I did. Then what is the problem? Richard looked toward the hallway leading upstairs, toward the closet, toward the cedar box he still had not opened. Maybe the problem, he said slowly, is that spending time with my family and working for my family are not the same thing. Melissa's face tightened. Nobody said you were working for us. Richard slid the schedule toward her. Then stop giving me shifts. The room went still. Melissa stared at him as though this quiet, reasonable sentence had broken an agreement Richard did not remember making. Then she picked up the paper, straightened its edges, and said, Fine. We will talk about this later. She left it on the table anyway. Richard watched her drive away. Then he picked up his phone and opened the family group chat again. Dad is free now. For the first time, Richard understood exactly what those words meant. They did not think he had gained his time back. They thought they had inherited it. The doorbell rang at 10:08 Tuesday morning, just as Richard was standing in the kitchen staring at the schedule Melissa had left behind. He folded the paper once and set it beside the coffee maker before opening the front door. Carol Hayes stood on the porch holding 2 paper cups and a small white bakery bag. I figured retirement had either made you incredibly relaxed or completely bored by now, she said. Richard stepped aside. It has been educational. Carol laughed and followed him into the kitchen. For 17 years, she had occupied the office 2 doors down from his, and she knew his silences almost as well as Susan once had. She placed 1 coffee in front of him and looked around. So, how is freedom? Richard gave a quiet smile. Busy. Already? Apparently retirement comes with management. Carol raised an eyebrow. Richard reached for the folded sheet and handed it to her. She opened it casually, expecting perhaps a list Richard had made for himself. Her smile disappeared as she read. Grandpa's weekly schedule, she said. You made this? Melissa did. Carol looked down again. School drop-off. Groceries. Laundry. Soccer. Dinner. Babysitting. She turned the page over as if there might be another explanation printed on the back. Is this temporary? Nobody mentioned an end date. Carol slowly placed the schedule on the table. Did she ask you before making it? Richard took a sip of coffee. Not exactly. What does not exactly mean? It means she handed it to me at dinner and explained where I needed to be. Carol studied him. Richard looked toward the window. They are busy. Melissa and Jason both work. Daniel has his own responsibilities. I understand that. That was not my question. Richard looked back at her. Carol tapped the schedule lightly. Did they ask? He did not answer. The silence answered for him. Carol leaned back in her chair. Richard, helping family is one thing. Being assigned to family is another. They do not mean anything by it. That does not mean it is nothing. The words settled between them. Richard glanced at the schedule again. Carol had seen him work through holidays, cancelled vacations, late nights, and emergencies. She had watched him come into the office exhausted after spending the night at the hospital when Susan was sick. She knew what 38 years had cost because she had spent 17 of them watching him pay. "Do you remember your retirement lunch?" she asked. "Most of it." "I asked what you wanted to do first." Richard nodded. "Wake up without an alarm." "And after that?" He smiled faintly. "I never got that far." Carol did not smile. "That is the problem." Richard frowned. "What is?" She leaned forward, her voice softer now. "When was the last time somebody asked what you wanted?" Richard opened his mouth, but no answer came. The refrigerator hummed behind him. A car passed outside. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started. Ordinary sounds filled the space where his answer should have been. Carol watched his face change. Not dramatically. Richard was not a dramatic man. But something in him seemed to stop defending everyone else. His eyes moved toward the hallway. Toward the stairs. Toward the bedroom where Susan's cedar box waited in the closet. "Susan used to ask," he finally said. Carol nodded. "I know." Richard looked down at his hands. "She had plans for us. You had plans for you too." His phone buzzed on the counter. "Melissa." A message appeared across the screen. "Reminder, Sophie needs pickup at 3. Please do not be late because I have a meeting." Carol could see enough of it from where she sat. She looked at Richard, but said nothing. Richard picked up the phone. His thumb moved automatically toward the reply field. For years, yes had been his easiest word. Yes to overtime. Yes to another bill. Yes to another favor. Yes because somebody needed him. He stopped before typing. Carol quietly asked, "Do you already have plans?" Richard's eyes drifted once more toward the stairs. "I think I might." "Then maybe you should find out what they are." After Carol left, Richard stood alone in the kitchen. The schedule remained on the table. Melissa's message remained unanswered. He walked upstairs, opened the closet, and lifted the cedar box from behind the winter coats. This time, when his fingers reached the latch, the phone buzzing downstairs did not stop him. Richard opened the box. Inside the cedar box, Richard found the life he and Susan had kept postponing. There were postcards from places they had never visited, a folded road map of California with the Pacific Coast Highway traced in blue ink, a brochure for Yellowstone National Park, and a photograph of a lighthouse on the Maine coast surrounded by brilliant October leaves. Beneath them lay a small notebook in Susan's handwriting. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and turned the pages slowly. Bar Harbor in October. Yellowstone before winter. Drive the California coast with no schedule. See the Grand Canyon at sunrise. Some entries had little stars beside them. Others had notes about hotels, restaurants, and roads Susan had wanted to take. Richard smiled when he found one sentence written beside California. Richard will complain about the gas prices, then admit the view was worth it. For the first time that morning, he laughed. It was quiet and brief, but real. Then he reached the final page. A white envelope rested there with his name written across the front. Richard knew Susan's handwriting instantly. He held it for several seconds before opening it. The letter was short. Susan had never needed many words when the right ones would do. She wrote about their marriage, their children, the years spent building a secure life, and all the times Richard had placed himself last because somebody he loved needed something. Near the bottom was one line that stopped him completely. "When you finally have time, Richard, please do not give all of it away." Richard read it again. Then once more. Downstairs, his phone began ringing. He did not move. Susan had written those words years before Melissa created the schedule, before Daniel needed garage repairs, before anyone decided retirement meant Richard had become permanently available. Yet somehow she had seen the pattern before he had. The ringing stopped. A minute later it started again. Richard folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his shirt pocket. When he finally went downstairs, Melissa was standing in the kitchen. "I called you 3 times, she said. Sophie was waiting at school." Richard looked at the clock. It was 3:24. "I lost track of time." Melissa stared at him. "You lost track of time?" "Yes. Dad, I had to leave a meeting. I told everyone you were picking her up." Richard noticed the word immediately. Told. Not asked. "Melissa, I never confirmed. You always pick them up. That does not make every afternoon yours." Her expression tightened. "Nobody said it was mine. I am asking for help. You are standing in my kitchen angry because I did not follow a schedule I never agreed to." Melissa crossed her arms. "Fine. Can you at least keep Saturday? Jason and I already made reservations." Richard shook his head. "I have plans Saturday." "What plans?" "Personal plans." "Dad, we need you." "Then you should have asked before making reservations." Melissa exhaled sharply. "Do you know what a babysitter costs on a Saturday night?" Richard held her gaze. "I know what my time costs." The sentence surprised both of them. Melissa stepped back slightly. "That is not fair." "What is not fair?" "Making family sound like a burden." Richard's voice stayed calm. "I never called you a burden." "Then why are you acting like helping your grandchildren is some kind of job?" Before Richard could answer, Daniel entered through the back door. Melissa had apparently called him. He looked from his sister to his father. "What happened?" Melissa explained quickly, each sentence turning Richard's refusal into something larger. Daniel listened, then looked at his father with disbelief. "Dad, it is one Saturday." Richard nodded. "And Thursday was one appointment. Wednesday was one delivery. Tuesday was one pickup. Every favor is only one thing when you're not the person doing all of them." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "What are you saving your time for?" The room went silent. Richard felt the letter against his chest. For a moment he saw Susan at the kitchen table years earlier, circling places on a map while he promised, after retirement. After the mortgage. After college. After the next emergency. After everything except life itself. Richard looked at both of his children. "Maybe," he said quietly, "I am saving it for whatever is left of mine." Neither Melissa nor Daniel answered. Richard walked to the table, picked up the printed schedule, and placed it between them. "I gave 38 years to a clock. I am not spending retirement pretending this one is different just because my family printed it." Melissa's anger softened into uncertainty, but Richard did not wait for an apology. He walked upstairs, returned to the cedar box, and unfolded Susan's map of California across the bed. For the first time in years, he stopped asking who needed him next and began asking where he wanted to go. The next morning, Melissa returned at 8:12 with the schedule in her hand and determination written across her face. Richard was already at the kitchen table, drinking coffee beside Susan's open cedar box. The California map had been folded neatly and placed beside him. Melissa noticed it but said nothing. "Can we settle this?" she asked. Richard looked at the schedule. "What needs settling?" "Next week. I moved a few things around, but I need to know you are going to be reliable." Reliable. Richard almost smiled at the word. 38 years of arriving early, staying late, raising 2 children, paying every mortgage payment on time, and carrying his family through emergencies, and now his reliability was being measured by whether he could make a 3 o'clock school pickup. Melissa placed the schedule in front of him. Monday and Wednesday are the important days. Saturday too. Daniel said he can handle his own stuff for now. Richard studied the page. And you already made these arrangements? Yes. Based on me doing them? Melissa hesitated. Yes. Richard looked toward Susan's box. Her letter was still in his shirt pocket. So we are good with the schedule? Melissa asked. Richard lifted his eyes to hers. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he answered, yes. Relief moved across Melissa's face immediately. Thank you. I knew we could work this out. She picked up her purse and kissed him lightly on the cheek. I have to get to work. I will text you if anything changes. Richard watched her leave. The front door closed. Her car disappeared down the street. Only then did he look at the schedule again. Yes, he whispered. But Melissa had misunderstood what he was agreeing to. Richard was finished saying yes to everyone except himself. At 8:43, he called Carol. You asked what I wanted, he said when she answered. I think I finally know. By 9:15, Richard was speaking with a travel agent. He started with California. Susan had always wanted to drive the Pacific Coast Highway, stopping wherever the view demanded it. Richard booked a flight to San Francisco for the following Monday morning, reserved a rental car, and planned a route south with no rigid timetable. At 10:30, he made another call, this one to a real estate agent named Patricia Monroe. The 4-bedroom house had once been exactly what Richard and Susan needed. Now half the rooms stored other people's belongings. Daniel's college boxes occupied one closet. Melissa kept holiday decorations in the basement. Old furniture waited in the garage because somebody might want it someday. Richard had spent years maintaining space for a family that had already built homes of its own. I am thinking about selling, he told Patricia. How soon could we list it? She paused. If you are serious, we could have photographs taken Friday and a sign-up by Monday. Richard looked around the kitchen. Monday works. The rest of the day became unexpectedly simple. He canceled the automatic payment for Melissa's weekly lawn service, an expense he had quietly covered since Jason changed jobs 2 years earlier. He called Daniel and told him the storage unit Richard paid for would transfer into Daniel's name at the end of the month. He removed himself as the default contact for appointments he had never agreed to manage. None of it was punishment. Richard was not cutting off his children. He was returning responsibilities to the adults who owned them. That afternoon, he began sorting the house. Keep. Sell. Donate. Family. 4 categories. Every object seemed to carry a memory. Susan's favorite coffee cup went into the keep box. Daniel's old baseball trophies went into family. The dining table where birthdays had been celebrated for 25 years would be sold. Richard felt sadness, but underneath it was something he had not expected. Lightness. At 4:17, Melissa texted him. Just confirming Monday morning. 6:30 sharp. Kids cannot be late. Richard read the message while holding the California map. He did not reply. Instead, he unfolded the schedule one final time and placed it on the kitchen table. With a red pen, he drew one clean line through Monday, then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Beneath the last entry, he wrote 4 words, living my own life. He stared at them, then added Susan's letter to his carry-on bag. For decades, Richard had believed freedom would arrive automatically when work ended. Now he understood something Susan had apparently known all along. Time did not become yours simply because you earned it. Sometimes you had to stop other people from claiming it first. At 6:30 Monday morning, Melissa stood in her kitchen with 2 lunch bags on the counter and one eye on the driveway. Ethan was searching for his left sneaker. Sophie was asking where Grandpa was. Jason poured coffee into a travel mug and glanced at the clock. He is usually early, he said. Melissa checked her phone. No message. At 6:36, she called Richard. The call rang until voicemail. She frowned and tried again. Nothing. At 6:42, irritation replaced concern. He confirmed this, she said. Jason looked at her. Did he actually confirm Monday? He said we were good with the schedule. At 6:49, Melissa called Daniel. He answered half asleep. Have you heard from Dad? She asked. Not since Friday. Why? He is supposed to be here. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Maybe he forgot. Melissa looked toward the children. Dad does not forget. That was the first thing anyone had said that morning that felt completely true. At 6:57, Jason grabbed his keys. I will take the kids. Melissa shook her head. I am going to Dad's. 15 minutes later, she turned onto Richard Street expecting to see his sedan in the driveway. Instead, she saw an empty strip of concrete and a white real estate sign standing in the front yard. For sale. Melissa slowed almost to a stop in the street. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she parked and walked quickly toward the house. Patricia Monroe's name and phone number were printed beneath the sign. Through the front window, the living room looked different. Cleaner. Emptier. Melissa unlocked the door with the spare key Richard had given her years earlier. Dad? Silence answered. She stepped inside. 2 framed photographs were gone from the hallway. The side table had been cleared. Several boxes near the stairs were labeled with names. Melissa. Daniel. Donate. In the dining room, chairs stood neatly around the table, but the room no longer felt like the family storage space she had always assumed would remain unchanged. Melissa walked into the kitchen and stopped. The schedule sat alone in the center of the table. Every day had been crossed out in red. Monday. Tuesday. Wednesday. Thursday. Friday. Saturday. Beneath them, Richard had written, living my own life. Next to the page rested an envelope with Melissa and Daniel's names on it. Her hands slowed as she opened it. Inside was a short note. I love you both. That has never been the question. But I worked for 38 years, and I will not spend the years I have left reporting for another shift I never accepted. I am not disappearing. I am taking the trip your mother and I kept postponing. The house is going on the market. Your belongings are boxed and safe. We will talk soon. Please do not mistake a boundary for abandonment. Dad. Melissa read the note twice. Her anger arrived first. You cannot be serious, she whispered. She called Richard again. Voicemail. Then Daniel. You need to come over. 20 minutes later, Daniel stood in the kitchen holding the note. He looked toward the boxes near the stairs. He is selling the house? Apparently. Without telling us? Melissa snapped. Exactly. Daniel lowered the paper. It is his house. Melissa stared at him. That is not the point. Then what is? She opened her mouth, but the answer would not come. Her phone buzzed. Jason. School drop-off handled. I had to move my first meeting. Also, sitter wants $160 for Saturday. Call me. Melissa stared at the message. Another notification appeared, this one from the lawn service. Future payments required an updated billing method. Daniel's phone buzzed almost immediately afterward. He read the message and frowned. The storage company says Dad transferred the account to me. Melissa looked at him. He planned all of this. Daniel glanced at the crossed-out schedule. Maybe that is the point. Melissa turned sharply. Whose side are you on? Nobody's. He paused. I am just realizing how much stuff Dad was handling that we stopped noticing. The kitchen fell quiet. On the refrigerator was an old photograph of Richard and Susan standing beside this very house, younger, smiling, their children small enough to fit between them. Melissa looked from that photograph to the empty rooms around her. She had thought her father was free because he no longer had a job. She had never considered that freedom might mean he was finally allowed to choose. At 8:26, nearly 2,000 miles away, Richard Bennett sat beside an airport window in San Francisco with Susan's letter in his pocket and a rental car reservation waiting downstairs. His phone showed 11 missed calls. He turned it face down, lifted his coffee, and watched the morning light spread across a city where nobody had scheduled a single minute of his day. Richard did not return the calls that morning. He rented a dark blue sedan, placed his suitcase in the trunk, and drove south until San Francisco began disappearing behind him. By late morning, the Pacific stretched beside the highway, bright and endless under a clear California sky. Richard lowered the window slightly and let the cool air move through the car. Susan's map rested on the passenger seat. There was no appointment waiting at the end of the road. No school pickup. No delivery window. No message telling him where he needed to be next. Around noon, he stopped at a roadside overlook because he wanted to. That simple fact nearly made him laugh. He stood beside the railing with the ocean hundreds of feet below and finally called Melissa. She answered before the first ring had finished. "Dad, where are you?" "California." Silence. "California?" "I landed this morning." "You could have told us." Richard looked toward the water. "I did. I left a note." A note after putting your house up for sale and disappearing across the country is not a conversation. Neither is handing someone a schedule and deciding their week belongs to you. Melissa went quiet. Richard could hear traffic on her end. "So this is punishment?" she asked. "No." His answer came immediately. "That is what you need to understand. I am not punishing anyone." "Then why cancel the lawn service? Why transfer Daniel's storage bill? Why leave us scrambling for childcare?" Richard's voice remained even. "Because those are your responsibilities. You were helping us." "Yes. Helping." Somewhere along the way, everyone forgot that helping is voluntary. Melissa did not answer. Richard continued, softer now. "I paid for that lawn service because Jason was between jobs. He has been working again for almost 2 years. I paid for Daniel's storage because he needed a few months. That was 3 years ago. I picked up the children because I loved seeing them. Then suddenly I was expected to be there before anyone bothered asking." Melissa exhaled. "We have jobs, Dad. We are busy." Richard looked down at Susan's map. "I know. I had one for 38 years. The words landed quietly. "When you were sick, I rearranged my work. When Daniel needed help, I rearranged my work. When your mother needed me, I rearranged everything. I did it because I loved you. But I never handed either of you an invoice afterward, and I never expected your adulthood to become repayment." Melissa's voice changed. Some of the anger drained away. "We never thought of it like that. That is exactly the problem." Back home, the absence Richard left behind was becoming visible in ordinary ways. Jason changed his morning schedule twice that week to handle school drop-off. Melissa hired a sitter for Saturday. Daniel spent an entire afternoon moving his own boxes from the storage unit. None of it was catastrophic. That mattered. Their lives did not collapse without Richard. They simply became responsible for themselves again. On Wednesday evening, Melissa and Daniel met at their father's house to sort the boxes he had labeled for them. Daniel found his high school baseball glove. Melissa found a stack of college textbooks she had forgotten existed. "Dad kept all this for us," she said. Daniel nodded. "He kept everything." Melissa sat on the bottom stair. "I thought he liked being needed." Daniel looked around the quiet house. "Maybe he did. That does not mean we were supposed to need him forever." Melissa said nothing. She remembered the schedule, the colored categories, the certainty with which she had assigned her father's mornings and afternoons. She had called it organization. From where she sat now, it looked different. 3 days later, Richard reached Monterey. He parked near the coast and walked until he found a bench overlooking the water. He took Susan's letter from his pocket. The paper was already beginning to soften along the folds. "You were right," he whispered. His phone buzzed. This time it was not a request, a reminder, or a new task. It was a message from Melissa. "Dad, I am sorry. I think I finally understand what we did. When you are ready, can we talk?" Richard read it twice. Then he smiled, because one word had changed everything. She had not told him to call. She had asked. Richard waited until sunset before calling Melissa. He was sitting on a wooden bench near the Monterey coast, Susan's letter folded carefully inside his jacket pocket, while the last light turned the Pacific into a sheet of copper. When Melissa answered, her face appeared on the screen almost immediately. For once, she did not begin with a request. "Hi, Dad." Richard smiled faintly. "Hi, sweetheart." Melissa looked tired. Not defeated, not angry, just thoughtful in a way Richard had not seen for a long time. "Where are you?" she asked. "Monterey. Mom wanted to go there." Richard looked toward the water. "She did." A silence followed, but it was not uncomfortable. Melissa finally said, "I found some of her travel brochures while Daniel and I were sorting the house." Richard nodded. "She saved them for years." "I did not know. There were a lot of things your mother and I kept putting off." Melissa lowered her eyes. "Because of us?" Richard could have made the moment hurt. He could have listed every sacrifice, every missed trip, every late night, every check written when money was tight. Instead, he shook his head. "Because of life. Work. Bills. Raising children. Your mother and I made those choices together. I do not regret raising you." Melissa swallowed. "But we kept expecting you to keep making those choices." Richard said nothing. She continued. "Jason and I paid the sitter Saturday. Daniel moved his storage boxes. I changed my hours twice for school pickup." A small, embarrassed smile crossed her face. "It was inconvenient. I imagine it was. That is when I realized something. None of those things were impossible. We just kept giving them to you because it was easier." Richard watched a gull drift above the shoreline. Convenience can become entitlement very quietly. Melissa nodded. "I am sorry, Dad. I really am. I treated your retirement like extra time the family had gained." Richard looked back at the screen. "That is what hurt." "I know." Her voice softened. "I thought because you loved being with the kids, you would want to do everything. I do love being with them. I understand the difference now." Richard waited. Melissa took a breath. "Dad, when you come home, would you like to have dinner with us?" He smiled. "Yes." She laughed softly, almost relieved. "I almost told you what night." "I noticed." "I am learning." A second face suddenly appeared beside hers. Sophie squeezed into the frame. "Grandpa, are you coming back?" "Eventually." "Can we still have pancake Saturdays?" Richard's expression softened. "Some Saturdays." Sophie frowned. "Not every Saturday?" "No, ma'am. Grandpa has plans now." "What plans?" Richard looked at the ocean. "I am still figuring that out." Sophie considered this seriously, then smiled. "Okay. Can I ask you when you get home?" Richard felt something warm rise in his chest. "That is exactly how it works." Melissa kissed Sophie's forehead and sent her away. When she turned back, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "I think Mom would be proud of you." Richard reached into his pocket and touched Susan's letter. "I think she would tell me I took long enough." They both laughed. A week later, Richard continued south. He stopped when he wanted coffee. He pulled over when the ocean looked too beautiful to pass without noticing. He spent an afternoon walking through a small coastal town that had never appeared on any schedule. The house back home remained for sale. Richard had decided he wanted something smaller, somewhere that required less maintenance and left more room for living. He was not abandoning his family. He was changing the terms by which he belonged to it. He would still show up for birthdays. He would still help when help was truly needed. He would still sit in the bleachers, make pancakes, answer late-night calls, and spoil his grandchildren more than Melissa preferred. But his time would no longer be treated like an open calendar waiting for other people's names. Several weeks later, Melissa called again. "Dad, Ethan has a game next month. Would you like to come?" Richard checked his calendar. For the first time, it contained things he had chosen for himself. "I would love to." Melissa smiled. "Then I will send you the time. No assignment. No assumption. Just an invitation." Richard ended the call and looked across the coastline Susan had once marked in blue ink. For 38 years, he had measured his life by how reliably he showed up for everyone else. Retirement taught him a different measure. Love could be generous without becoming surrender. Family could need him without owning him. And time, once given away, could never be earned back. Richard unfolded Susan's letter one more time and smiled at the sentence that had changed everything. Then he looked toward the open road ahead and finally understood what retirement meant. He had not stopped being a father, a grandfather, or a man his family could count on. He had simply remembered that he was also Richard Bennett. And from that day forward, if anyone wanted his time, they could ask for it. They could not assign it.